Censorship has always really interested me, both because I worked with Russian literature in the USSR, where censorship has been incredibly productive. Like some of the very best literature has been written under extremely heavy censorship, which does all kinds of things. It makes for really great writing, and which teaches its readers how to read it. And so you also get these sort of populations of really good readers who read between the lines, who are looking for clues and codes and all kinds of things. So I'm interested in that, and also since what I work with is oral literature and bardic traditions and people in the USSR who were not Russian. So it's all this stuff, it's oral literature and they're minorities. And they were thought to be very, very much caught in by the Soviet state. So these were people that nobody ever thought of as defying the state or defying censorship. And not only that, but the Soviet period is often ignored for culture by people who say, well, it's just a time when everything was really repressed. This is a story of how a traditional bardic genre transmitted by oral tradition simultaneously flourished under and defied the censorship apparatus of the USSR in the Caucasian Republic of Azerbaijan. Although the Ashik genre is little known in the West and the USSR is now in the past, the story of how this art was pulled into state sponsorship and the story of how it questioned and resisted the Soviet state reveals how complex and productive the dance of censorship can be. This is also a story of a class that is rarely thought of as resistant, the rural traditional practitioners of a 500-year-old genre who both dialogued with and inspired the progressive urban elite through lyric and song. As part of the Soviet Union's grand utopian experiment, Azerbaijan experienced the same upheavals and traumatic events that rocked the entire USSR. After Lenin's Bolshevik Party consolidated power in the 1920s, the rise of Stalin after visual aids, after 1925 led to the era of the terror, which saw persecution, exile, and execution of huge numbers of people of all social classes, from intellectuals to farmers. The state ran a virulent anti-religious campaign as well as other attempts to completely break and remake society. However, the terror subsided during World War II as the new country rallied courageously to defeat the Nazi army on the Eastern Front. After the death of Stalin in 1953, life in the USSR began to stabilize and improve, and by the 1960s, thaw under Khrushchev. He's not here. Yeah, he got. Oh well, that's Brezhnev. Oh well, sorry. Azerbaijan was becoming modernized and industrialized. Roads, schools, hospitals had been built, and education and literacy were near universal. One thing amazing, the Soviet Union. They took a Russian empire that had about 2% literacy and brought it to universal literacy by 1920-something. It's really kind of amazing. Though the education was Soviet, it was strong in some areas and problematic in others. The long Brezhnev stagnation era brought stability back to Soviet life, but by the 1970s, society was rife with undercurrents of dissent. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost, openness, were intended to revitalize the USSR, but instead led to its demise. In 1991, the Azerbaijan Soviet Socialist Republic became the Independent Republic of Azerbaijan, which you have today. The Soviet state, they felt that that culture was really the most important thing. It was their biggest tool of propaganda. Stalin called all artists engineers of the human soul, and they saw it as absolutely vital. Art was put under state control in a very intense way. If you were an artist of any type, like you guys, if you wanted to publish anywhere, you would be registered with the Union of Soviet Writers, and you didn't get paid you didn't have a competitive marketplace. You had ideological editors who would decide. So they'd say, okay, this year we're going to write on these themes, the fulfillment of the 5-year plan, which has not been fulfilled, that kind of thing. You were working for the state, and you were handsomely rewarded. And in the non-Russian republics, it was a little bit different in that the USSR wanted to encourage sort of national identity as part of their nation-building thing, but they wanted to control national expression. So these are people who are not Russian, right? And so they have a kind of a different national past. In fact, Azerbaijan was part of the Persian Empire. They're Shia Muslims. They speak a language similar to Turkish. So they've had a past where they've been deeply involved in with Iran and Turkey and Islamic civilization, and they've been cut off. And they're in the USSR and told, okay, that's not your history. Your history is you were in the darkness, and your culture was completely backwards and evil, and then the Russians came and enlightened you, and that's your history now, right? And so the new generations, by 2 generations, they had used a different alphabet before the Soviet Union. They used the Persian alphabet, what we call the Arabic alphabet. So within a generation, they burned all those books in case they were Qurans. And within a generation, nobody could read the old books. And they wrote in Cyrillic. They were told, they had this was actually Stalin's idea, he was Commissar of Nationalities, that what you needed to write was socialist in content, but national in form. So they wanted you to sing, use Azerbaijani music, use Azerbaijani language, but what you should be singing about is Lenin and the 5-year plan and the success of Bolshevism and that kind of thing. In the new model, Russian intellectual achievements were lauded, and Azerbaijanis were to see themselves as part of the USSR with a center in Moscow. Azerbaijanis were cut off from their cultural, linguistics, and spiritual ties to Iran and the Turkic world, their heritage of classical literature, and their long cultural development as part of Islamic civilization. Musical arts also fell under state control in the Azerbaijani Soviet Socialist Republic. As Aida Husseinova writes, music played an important role in Soviet politics, as music has in politics of all empires, we can think about that, because it created an artistic facade for the regime and served as an effective vehicle for propaganda. So for the non-Russian peoples, national, indigenous, or folk musics were encouraged, but must adhere to national in form and socialist in content. Under this doctrine, a musician could play a 500-year-old song, but the lyrics should be optimistic, praising the achievements of the USSR and its leaders. As a state sworn to benefit workers and peasants, the USSR especially sought traditional folk genres to promote the new Soviet national culture among non-Russian peoples. So in fact, a traditional genre like the ashik, especially, it was rural, it was from the country, it was like peasant culture. So they were promoted by the Soviet state, and they were given all these sort of new stages, new places to perform, so they were actively encouraged. So the ashiks, actually, they're coming from a rural peasant class who benefited a lot under the USSR, and they were absolutely fine with singing about the cotton harvest, the success of the cotton harvest. They were in a society that had benefited them. But at the same time, remember, it's oral tradition. So while they'd burned all those books in Arabic script, these people still knew centuries of these epics and old romance stories, religious stories that they were still telling in the villages. So they'd go to the Cotton Harvest Festival and sing the Lenin song, and then they go home to the village, or here's a jubilee for Ashik Ali, who was thought of as kind of a saint. He was like a Sufi. And so they were still going to the village and still singing all the old songs. So that in itself was sort of defiant in a way that I think people did not even think about. So they had this kind of parallel lives where they both supported the regime but their identities were fluid enough that they were able to continue to keep the old culture alive. One thing that interests me about this situation, too, is that this is a case where the rural traditional singers had something in common with the sort of intellectual elite, in that they were both very interested in keeping these alternative histories alive. And so the dialogue, there's a dialogue in verse. This is a big thing in this culture. You write a poem, and people write an answering poem, and you might sing it, and they sing it back, or write it, and they write it back. And there's a dialogue in verse between these two. This is Samed Vorgun, who was a poet and intellectual. He spoke perfect Russian. He translated all kind of Russian literature, even Pushkin, into, it's very hard to translate, into Azerbaijani. He served on some Moscow committees. He was a very important Soviet guy and intellectual. And this is Ashik Nabat, who was a girl who was from the country, who grew up, and she loved the Ashik art, and so she started playing, and they met. And Samed Vorgun watched her play, and then he wrote a poem for her called Let's Talk. And you can look at it there. I won't take the time to read it, but what I will do is read a little about it. So this was written in 1938. This is the height of the Stalinist terror. This is when we'd come back for the next meeting and one of us would be gone. I mean, it was really, really the height of it. So, written at the height of the terror in 1938, Vorgun's poem shows the extent to which artists could engage in alternative public conversation through the vehicle of poetry. Although the Communist Party claimed the answer to every question, Vorgun proposes a question with 1,000 answers. At a time when public discourse could not have been more dangerous, he asks his listeners to call a gathering, open a conversation, and ask the ashik, that's the singer, to take up the saz. The poem remains in what seems like a modest domestic realm, using traditional tropes of Azerbaijani lyric poetry to speak of a beloved. But this beloved is made of flowers, clouds, and snow like the mountains of his homeland. Carefully veiled but clear on closer reading, this is a love song to Azerbaijan. Passing this poem to Ashik Nabat, who would sing it everywhere, he ensured it would circulate through the country and reach the festivals, villages, and collective farms where she played. So here we see moving from print culture, right, into oral culture. She wrote back, and several years later, for the 50th anniversary of the October Revolution, another Let's Talk. And I love the first line, my brother poet, you with the pen and I with the saws. Again, alluding to those two classes, right? The intellectual elite and the peasants. And so about this one, I write, despite being written for a Soviet holiday, there is no reference to the triumph of the revolution. It doesn't even mention it, right? To communism or to Russian or Soviet culture. In the song, Nabat never even mentions the Soviet Union, referring only to a 50-year spring that refers to and praises Azerbaijan. The beautiful spring is in our homeland, and that word, yordamuz, is a very emotionally charged word, like motherland. It's not, they wouldn't say it about the USSR. They'd say it's our country, right? Different word. And using actual place names ground her song firmly in the Azerbaijani soil, which she mentions as the source of the wealth, riches, and plenty to which we must show enduring faithfulness. Writing in 1967, during the Thaw era, she can now be clear in her answer to the poet, 29 years in the coming. The poet can now speak his heart. Our homeland, these mountains, this soil can openly be called the beloved. Azerbaijan has endured. Ashik Nabat's song decenters Moscow as the place to where Azerbaijanis should look for inspiration on this Grand October University, recentering the celebration in the small, the local, and the unique. For Ashiks like Nabat, being Soviet was absorbed as yet another facet of the complex Azerbaijani identity. The positive attitude towards the USSR found in much Ashik poetry should be seen as not merely bowing to the demands of the state. Ashik arts demonstrate how the Soviet era was synthesized into the existing cultural system, accepting what was positive, such as universal suffrage, women's emancipation, education, electricity, etc., while rejecting what was harmful, assumed Russian superiority, atheism, hostility to Islamic culture, and the rewriting of history. Ashik Nabat was in every sense a loyal Soviet, yet in her song Let's Talk, it is clear that she was an Azerbaijani first. Never meant to rebel against the Soviet Union, 20th century Ashiks worked from within, seeking to enact change by changing the very discourses of which Soviet life was woven, the most important invective being to keep talking. In his novel Master and Margarita, Russian writer Mikhail Bulgakov coined the vertiginous phrase, manuscripts don't burn. Written in the 1930s, this book of the devil's adventures in Moscow was not published until 1967, well after the author's death. The surprise publication of this hidden secret novel was something of a miracle in the USSR, proving indeed that manuscripts don't burn and showing the persistence of literature to overcome the forces of censorship, even when those forces were armed with the full power of the state. Far from destroying literature in the USSR, censorship pushed writers to greater heights and produced some of the 20th century's most outstanding literature, much of it well known to the world, like Bulgakov's novel. The story of how Azerbaijani Ashik bards, thought to be the very face of Soviet propaganda, also resisted the Soviet Union is not so well known. In fact, only known by y'all right now. Folk traditions are often only appreciated by their native audience. To the American ear, the Ashik might sound shrill, the saz tinny, the lyrics mundane. However, to the Azerbaijani ear, it can be the voice of the land, the music of the mountains, the song heard in the cradle, the music of home. Music travels easily across boundaries and refuses to stay put in ideological boxes. Folk music is especially powerful, evoking as it does the nostalgia for a simpler life when the imagined dawn of the nation. The music of the saz evoked an Azerbaijan that was older and deeper than the Soviet Union and simply could not be contained by it. The Soviet policy of using the power of folk music for propaganda was playing with a two-edged sword. While a beloved saz song could bring its strength to the songs of Lenin, these same songs could be easily recombined with alternative ideologies and played with the same evocative power. And here I get to Zizek. As Slavoj Žižek points out, if music is thought of in terms of the concrete pleasures it gives, which he calls knots of libidinal investment, then these pleasures can be liberated from or joined to any ideology whatsoever. And so I felt very much that these, like that pleasure of the music, of folk music, of something that feels traditional and home and very deep. Sure, you can pick it up and put it in a Soviet box, but then you can pick it up and put it in another box, right? I concluded here that far from controlling the Ashik genre, Soviet policies that encouraged its teaching and performance ended up allowing it the space to develop as a multifaceted dialogue between Azerbaijanis of all regions and classes. As that dialogue developed, it could not be controlled. Not only did the genre carry with it a parallel culture that was supposed to have been erased, but it continued to grow and react to the events of the 20th century. For much of its history, the relationship of the Azerbaijani bard with the USSR was not a rebellion, but a dance. In their very voices, ashiks allowed, past and present, Azerbaijani and Soviet to meet, mingle, and dialogue in an ongoing conversation. And as a living oral tradition, the genre changed with the times, each time producing its own relationship to the state, its very flexibility preserving its existence. Let's see. Thanks to the Azerbaijani bards, to the folklorists who transcribe their lyrics, and to today's ashiks who carry their songs, we have the story of how the rural performers of an old bardic genre worked with, took on, and transcended one of the most powerful states of the 20th century. And that, as the master ashiks say, is a story worth telling.